Welcome back together for the story of us. We are going to take another jump today in time and even more so in place. We are going to begin the transition to the Iberian Peninsula, to what we would now call Spain and Portugal. So we're going to have to go backwards in time. Oh, yes, thank you, Samantha. I am going to co-host you. So we are going to go backwards in time in order to tell the full story of Jews of the Iberian Peninsula, and we'll sort of go over some of this history and some of this story as well. But we're going to, once we make our way over there in our telling of the story of us, we are, like we did with the Roman period, like we did with the early Talmudic period, we are going to sit in the Spanish period for a while. We will spend a number of weeks really digging in. It's known as the Golden Age of Muslim Spain, or the Golden Age of Jewry, or sometimes just called the Golden Age. And one of the interesting things that I have learned as a part of getting ready for this is that it is only Jews who refer to this as a Golden Age. It's only Jews who even call it the Golden Age of Muslim Spain. And I think we'll get a sense of why that is today. I see folks trying to come in. Oh, Samantha's got it, thank you. I also want to hold out that the discussion we're going to have around Jews living in Muslim Spain is impossible to separate from our contemporary politics today. As much as any of the other topics we have covered, more than many of them, people are debating their own biases when they are talking about this era. So let me give some examples of what this means. There are a lot of reasons that folks are invested in telling a story where the Golden Age of Muslim Spain was a utopia for Jews. To counter Islamophobia, for reasons that are anti-Zionist polemics about how Jews and Muslims used to be together, right? There's all sorts of different incentives and reasons that people fall into this category, but that's a real mistake for us to make as well. Jews were second-class citizens, faced significant and real discrimination. This was not a utopia for Jews. And it was better than any time or any place that Jews had lived. Gosh, I don't even know what the exceptions would be. Probably some Talmudic periods in the Neo-Persian Empire had moments like this. Germany in the pre-World War I period was probably like this. And then America of the post-World War II era. Those are roughly the other golden ages that we can talk about and talk about the Spanish Golden Age through. But there are also all sorts of reasons and polemical reasons for people to suggest that things were much worse in the Golden Age of Spain for Jews. People who want to emphasize a Judeo-Christian view on the world, often for Islamophobic reasons rather than against Islamophobia. So there's all of these contemporary politics that play into it, and you almost can't find a historian of this period that is not a part of it. In fact, here I can just give you the name of one of the premier historians of the Inquisition, and this will make things clearer. Benjamin Netanyahu. Bibi Netanyahu's dad, Bibi Netanyahu, same name, which makes it a little tough here, was one of the premier historians of the Inquisition. Very clearly, he is coming into this with a significant and clear to us cultural and political bias when looking at these issues, but everyone is about this. So that's my pre-warning before we really dig into the content. Any questions or comments or reactions to that before we really dig in? Miriam. Ooh, hold on, we don't hear you, Miriam. Let me figure out why that is. Oh, I see why. Oh, I didn't plug this in. That's why. Okay, go ahead, Miriam. Sorry, I think we can hear you now.
Are you talking, when you were talking just now about Bibi Netanyahu, are you talking about the actual real one right now being a historian?
His father. His father.
His father was. Oh,
Yeah, one of the premier historians of the Inquisition.
wow.
Yeah, right?
Thank you.
Super interesting. You can also see how that may have impacted Bibi Netanyahu's worldview and politics as well. But that'll come later in our story of us. Okay, any other questions or thoughts before we dig in and tell this story?
I am just curious, and I imagine that you will cover this at some point, about when there began to
They're not
be
loud.
a recognized difference between Ashkenazi and Sephardi.
Yes, we will talk about that today. I will say that it is not yet that they are distinctive ethno-cultural groups during the time period we're going to cover today. We're going to cover roughly the year 0 until the year 900 or so within the Iberian Peninsula. During this time period, the distinction between an Ashkenazi Jew and a Jew of Spain is much more where you live and the cultural influences on you than anything else. When I am describing who Ashkenazi Jews are, I have stopped using the traditional descriptors. And I actually think the best way to understand is that Ashkenazi Jews are the Jews whose families are kicked around Europe, ethnically cleansed from end to end to end of Europe, basically every second or third generation for the last 1,000 years. That's who the Ashkenazi Jews are. This lines up also with genetic analyses of Ashkenazi Jews. We can see that most Ashkenazim can be traced back to 4 women 1,000 years ago. So blame them for your stomach issues. No, we don't have names, but genetically they can narrow it down that there is what they call a genetic bottleneck that happens. And so, you've heard that Ashkenazi Jews are all third cousins from each other or whatever it is genetically, and that is the reason why we have that there. So yeah, we are talking basically right until that bottleneck.
But that bottleneck is not there for the Sephardi.
So, but the Sephardim don't bottleneck. Exactly. So it is really only post-bottleneck that we start getting this. Yes, let me see if I can get this speaker to get louder. I think it's just came unplugged down here. It's my guess. Yep.
Okay. Oh, right.
I should make this turn on,
Mr. Techie.
which will help with the sound. Sarah.
Okay, my question is just so that I'm clear, the groups that move into the Iberian Peninsula are groups that were in places like Morocco and Egypt.
Opposite direction. We'll tell that story today, but no, it's the opposite direction.
Okay, so were there Jews along in the Levant there prior to the Inquisition?
That's the story we're telling today. We're not even going to touch the Inquisition today.
I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm going to shut up and let you talk.
Okay, any other precursor questions before we jump into this history? Okay, like everything else, the further back we go in time, the more speculative we are being and the less historically certain we can be. So there are some pretty reasonable theories that suggest the Jews enter the Iberian Peninsula right around the time of the destruction of the temple. So right around the year 700 or so CE. Everything we're dealing with today is on our side of 0. You'll remember, and I keep trying to reinforce this, that the destruction of the temple is like saying White House down. Sure, the building is important. Sure, it was traumatic that the temple was destroyed. But if the White House has fallen, there's the collapse of a government and a civilization much broader than that. And the same is very much true of the temple. If the temple has fallen, then what we are dealing with is a situation oops, sorry, I hit the mute button, then what we are dealing with is a situation where the society, Jewish civilization, has significantly collapsed, that we have seen enormous ethnic cleansing and genocide and mass poverty and starvation and disease and rape as a tool of war and just the worst that can happen, it is the destruction of a civilization. So there are some documents that suggest that as many as 80,000, that's 80,000 Jews are carried off from Judea, from Israel, from Roman-occupied Judea, and taken to the Iberian Peninsula, to Roman Spain. This probably, if it happened, was actually not around the year 70. It probably was instead, 100 years later or so. Probably can be lined up with things like the Bar Kokhba rebellion, the Roman ethnic cleansing of Jews from around Judea, the renaming of Judea as Syrio-Palestine as a way to eliminate the Judeanness of it. All of these sorts of things that the Romans do. I know it's impossible to say something like that without thinking of contemporary politics, by the way, but this is, of course, a very different Palestinian identity we are talking about, even though they have the same word, and even though there's all sorts of people who want to make political connections or lack of connections there. But the Roman move itself is, of course, to de-Judaize the space, and as a part of that, as many as 80,000 Jews are carted off into slavery into the Iberian Peninsula. This maybe didn't happen, but by the time we get into the 3rd or 4th centuries, we start seeing Jewish names and even some Hebrew sometimes on gravestones. So we know that there are Jews there, and enough Jews that there's enough of a Jewish community to bury them Jewishly as well by the 3rd or 4th century. So we see this slow move into Spain. Now, one of the really interesting things for me is the population of Spain at this point is known as the Visigoths. If you remember your European history of high school. Pre-Christian Visigoths engage in significant anti-Jewish behavior that looks like the Inquisitions. Forced conversions, just really, it stunned me because I didn't understand that there was any history of these sorts of things prior to Christendom coming back in after the end of the Islamic Golden Age. But really it was striking to me to see the ways that the Inquisition can be understood not as a standalone response to Christendom coming back in, but instead as a constant part of what was happening in this space. Similarly, when we look at the Holocaust in the story of us, we are going to look at the Holocaust not as a singular event, but as the next spot in a pretty linear progression of European anti-Jewish ethnic cleansings and genocides, which is just a very different frame than many of us learn the Holocaust in. We learn the Holocaust as exceptional, and I'm going to try to paint it as not exceptional. And similarly, I think the Inquisition is not exceptional to this area. It is the Muslim period that is the exception. Yeah.
Did the Visigoths have an anti-Muslim element, and did they have an anti-Christian element as well?
So it's not entirely clear, and I don't know a lot about them. If you didn't hear the question, Suzanne asked, did the Visigoths have anti-Christian and anti-Muslim sentiments? The politics of this time period are all about the great powers, and we are in a moment where there are two great ethno-states is not the correct word, theostates, theo-empires, theocracy, whatever the word is, where we have the Muslim empire, the Islamic empire, which is in some ways the Neo-Persian Empire, which in some ways was the Persian Empire, which was the Babylonian Empire. I missed that it was other things, but right, it was the Greek Empire, it was the Assyrians, you can go all the way back. And we've got the Western Empire. We've got the Christian Empire. And what we're seeing is this fusion of religious identity and empire into one thing, and these two empires at war with each other. So the battle zones end up in relationship to both of them. Actually, I'm going to jump ahead to what we were going to talk about because I think it'll help frame. Has anyone heard of the mythology of the Khazars?
Yeah.
Khazaris. There's a famous book called The Khuzari, written actually by someone during the Spanish Golden Age.
Yes.
13th tribe.
Yeah, the 13th tribe.
Yeah.
So the Khuzaris are a Turkish tribe that sometime in the 8th century or so. Oh, interestingly, this just asked me if I was speaking Arabic for translation or for captions. That's interesting. Sometimes 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th centuries, there's a lot of mythology around this. The story goes that they converted en masse to Judaism. Almost certainly it turns out that it's only the leadership that converts, only the senior leadership. There's also a number of politically motivated anti-Semitic lies that say that Ashkenazi Jews are the descendants of Khuzari converts, which is anti-Semitic for all sorts of reasons. The first of which is that we get to determine our own tribal rules, and people who convert are just as Jewish as anyone who is born Jewish. And so the outside world doesn't get to say that we are less valid because we may have had ancestors who converted, right? Like, to me, that is actually the first most important one. And the second is that there have been robust genetic analyses done, including in the last couple of years, that show actually that this is entirely not true. But I can't tell you how many times a day I am told on social media that I am not a real Jew. I am a Khuzari imposter. 30 times a day I get a comment like this. 40 times a day I get a comment like this. Yeah, I mean, it's wild. It's wild. I mean, I ignore them, but so
As if a Jew wouldn't know what a Jew is.
exactly.
Who were the people who were saying this?
Mostly people on social media is what we're talking about.
But you don't know what
They
their
don't know anything.
background is, or they all.
No, it's all, look, the truth of it is it's all a part of trying to make an argument that delegitimizes Israel. That's what the politics of this are about. And like,
Is it organized?
Danny, I have a real quick question before we go.
hold on, Sarah. Let me do one more thing about the Khuzaris, and then I will take your question. Okay. Is this, you all are not seeing this right now, correct?
No.
I can change that. Now are you seeing it?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Samantha, for doing that. This is not a highly scientific map that we're looking at, but ignore that for a moment. Khuzari Empire is probably not nearly as big. But what I want you to see here is that to the east and south of the Khuzari Empire is the Islamic Empire. And
This is nomad country.
yeah, right. This is Turkish areas. Yeah, this is Genghis Khan area, right? But to
Where my son's ancestors were from.
there you go.
Yeah.
So
He is a Khazari.
there you go. The people to the west of this, though, is Christendom. Why did the Khazari? Well, geopolitically, we can look at this and say that what's happening here is the Khazari is the buffer region between these two great powers that are at war with each other. And for that reason, there's incentives for both of those great powers to allow them to continue. It provides a buffer zone for both of them. But for the
It allows
Khazaris,
them to say that they're neutral. They don't care.
exactly. And so for the Khazaris, not being Christian and not being Muslim were both really important. And so you can see why the political incentive was there for their leadership to choose a third option, which was still in relationship with the other two options, and thus convert to Judaism. It doesn't last for very long and is most famous today because a important poet and politician and general of the Spanish Golden Age, Yehuda Levi, writes a book called The Khuzari. And it is a philosophical imagining of why Judaism is better. And the philosopher king of the Khuzaris recognizes that. And it sort of pits the straw men of Islam and Christianity against it. And that's why we know the Khuzaris more than anything else today. But what that means is for the Jews of the Spanish Golden Age, the Khuzaris were something like Camelot, maybe was, or I'm forgetting what the name of it. There was in Christendom during the time of the Crusades, there's this rumor of the Far Eastern Christian army that's just defeating Muslim hordes everywhere that they go, and it's not real. It probably actually was Genghis Khan that they're referencing and didn't realize it's certainly not Christian. But that's what the Khuzari Empire ends up being for Jews, is this mythological place where Jews have power, even as
There
it's
was
sort
a
of maybe
John
existed.
the somebody who was an itinerant Christian somebody wandering
Yeah,
through Central
yeah,
Asia
exactly.
at this point in time.
Yeah, that's who I'm referencing, Miriam. I'm forgetting the name. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, John something or other.
Yeah, one of those Johns, not Jim's.
Jim.
Yeah.
Not a Jim.
Okay, Sarah Heyman.
Okay, my question is, so you were saying there was this great deal of forced conversion going on, and
Now we're back to Spain. Now we're back to the 600s, 500s, 700s, the
And you were
Visigoths.
saying
Yep,
it was by the Visigoths.
by the Visigoths.
Okay, so this was Visigoths who had entered the Roman Empire, adopted Roman Christianity and Roman life, and were taking over the empire.
So this is no. This is prior to a lot of that. These are the Visigoths of Spain, of the Iberian Peninsula, and a lot of the anti-Jewish sentiments that we find in the Visigoths seem to be because Jews are associated with the Roman Empire, and it's actually anti-Romanness.
They're associated with the Roman Empire and associated with the Muslims. This is in the Iberian Peninsula.
Well, not Muslims yet. Hold on. We're talking the pre-Muslim age in the Iberian Peninsula.
Pre-Muslim age.
The Visigoths are pre-Muslim, and Jews are associated with the empire and are facing significant discrimination because of that. At some point, as we move forward, the Visigoths convert en masse to the Nicene Creed. They become Christians.
Okay, so where did we come from that we were in the Iberian Peninsula? How did we get there?
So we spread with the Romans. Remember I said that there was some rumor that as many as 80,000 Jews were taken as slaves there as a part of that. So we see this slow progression, and as things...
migrated. We didn't migrate.
It's always a combination of things with Jewish migration, is what I would say.
Okay, because I was thinking that there were still a bunch of us still in the Persian region.
For sure. This is separate. We're telling the story of the Iberian Peninsula as it sits next to the story of...
Okay, so these are simultaneous, coming
Correct.
along simultaneous.
Correct.
Two branches.
Correct.
Okay, and as you said, a bunch of us got slaves, and a bunch of us came along because it was convenient, or because we were being swept up with this. You know, people do. They go. You know, they move around.
So exactly, for all sorts of reasons, we are seeing this migration, and we are seeing significant Jewish population ending up there. Even as bad as it was under the Visigoths. I'm going to click the mute all button, by the way. I'm getting background noise again, but obviously unmute yourself, everyone, when you have something. As bad as it was under the Visigoths, it was much worse under Christendom. And when the Visigoths convert to Christianity, sometime in the 7th century, probably maybe 8th century, things get significantly worse than that. It gets really intolerable. There's even some records that say the Jews of the Iberian Peninsula are all turned into slaves at this point, or attempted to turn into slaves. And we get so many of the things we end up associating with the Inquisition that it turns out are happening prior to the Inquisition. We get Jews who are forced to convert to Christianity and then are never treated as full members of Christian society and are dealt with as suspect members. We see pogroms against Jews where all of their property and belongings are taken, and then the same is done to Christians who used to be Jews who have converted. We see it happen. Also, at the same time, there's a whole bunch of incidents. Prester John, thank you, Miriam. there's a whole bunch of incidences, and we see this in some of the legal codes of Jews who wouldn't allow their children to be baptized, had their children taken away from them and raised in boarding homes. Just awful things that, again, at least for me, I associated with Inquisition era Iberian Peninsula. And so it was really interesting, horrifying, but interesting to see that this actually goes back much, much further. So it should be no surprise that as things are getting terrible for Jews in Christian lands, as things get really awful for Jews in the Iberian Peninsula after it becomes a part of Christendom, that Miriam says, but why would pre-Christian Visigoths be down on us? Because we were associated with Romans. Right, this is that classic thing. The Jews are associated with whoever the bad guy is. Jews are communists in capitalist society and capitalists in communist societies. And so what we end up with is a situation where things are pretty good, relatively speaking, in this new Muslim empire for Jews. And so as this empire begins to make way towards the Iberian Peninsula, coming north from Morocco, right? If you look at a map, let's just go ahead and look at this map for a moment, because it's actually pretty stunning when you realize the absurdity of thinking of Morocco as Africa and Spain as Europe, and being such like diametrically different societies when
Close.
right? Look at this, just how close it is. So this is what ends up happening, is that this new Islamic empire begins making inroads towards the Iberian Peninsula. And we get this from Christian sources and from Muslim sources, that Jews living in the Iberian Peninsula begin sneaking intelligence to the Muslim army just across the Straits of Gibraltar, right? We become the, what do they call it, the fifth column, the whatever, third, I'm forgetting the name, but right? And it turns out we probably were that for pretty good reason. To the point that when Islam comes through, it sweeps through, takes Cordoba, one of the major cities early on, and as the armies keep going, they leave Cordoba in charge of the Jews. Jewish militias end up in charge of this city. We'll explore this in coming weeks, but we have all sorts of examples of Jews being generals of the army of these cities or these areas or the Iberian Peninsula or wherever it is, which is just a wild thing to imagine. Jews in charge of Muslim armies, right? Like, pretty remote, or any Armenians, he says, but, well, Israel.
Well, yeah.
So this is the progression of Jews into Muslim Spain. And as the peninsula becomes dominated by Islam, and a particularly, it's worth saying, tolerant version of Islam, even for the time period, and only for the time period. I don't think any of us would go back in time and say, oh, this is so tolerant. But for the time period it was, we see Jews moving more and more and more across North Africa and making their way to the Iberian Peninsula. In particular, there's a huge economic downturn, probably a multi-year drought is what it's about, that happens in Persia. And so we see a real decline in Persian Jewry and in what we would now call Iraqi Jewry, but not in the Jews, just in these whole societies have extended economic downturns. And so Jews begin leaving, but following from one part of the Islamic Empire to the other part of the Islamic Empire to this other area that seemed better, into the Iberian Peninsula. So that by the time we get to Maimonides, for instance, which is, only 1100 or so. So not far from where we're talking right now. By the time we get to Maimonides, we once again are living in a world where there are two poles of Jewish civilization in tension and in communication with each other. This time it is Iberian Jewry and Babylonian Jewry. And we're really seeing a shift towards Iberian Jewry that is happening during this time period. Okay, let's pause again and see if there's any questions or thoughts on this as we're sort of framing these big ideas. Nothing? Okay. So,
Question?
oh, go ahead, Samantha.
What would be some of those differences between the Iberian Jewry, I can't even talk, and Babylonian? How much of a tension is it at that point?
Yeah. Great question. So let's go back to Babylon for a moment, where we spent the last few weeks. And I mean Babylon, Bavel in the Jewish sense. Babylon is the word Bavel that Jews used to refer to Mesopotamia, Iraq, Iran, Neo-Persian Empire, the home of the caliphate, whatever other political terms are applied internally to the Jewish community, the word is Bavel that we use. So I apologize when I say Babylon. That is what I am talking about, the Jews of that region. So the Talmud is closed basically by the time Islam rises, probably connected to each other. The political disruption and upheaval just redefined Jewish reality enough that this project and the institutions that had supported it begin to end. Right? Even just in a practical sense, we see Jewish populations migrate away from these Jewish population centers and towards the capital of Baghdad. Both of the important Talmudic houses of Sura and Pumbedita move away from their original homes and move towards Baghdad. And this level of disruption means that the process of writing the Talmud ends and the process of creating the Talmud begins. Right? And
I have one more question.
hold on, Sarah. And what I mean by creating the Talmud is that it is all of these different conversations and scraps and ideas and books. It is a multi-generational undertaking to take it, to edit it down, to put it into some sort of rational-ish order, and to begin to standardize it. So that if you have a copy of Tractate Bava Metzia, there can also be a tractate of Bava Metzia that exists across the world in the Iberian Peninsula, for instance. So that is the project that is happening in the 600s, 700s. And by the time we get into the 700s, 800s, 900s, it's what becomes known as the Gaonic period. And the Gaonic period, Gaon means genius. And what happens is the Talmud is entirely unwieldy. Who here has spent any time studying Talmud? Just put up a hand if you have a little bit. Right, like if you have a practical question for Jewish life, you find an incredibly valuable diamond on the ground, what should you do with it? Practical Jewish question. Or if you have a question about how to keep kosher, whatever it is, you can't open up the Talmud looking for an answer. It's not like you can turn to page 734 and find the answer to your question. You're going to turn to page 743, whatever, and discover that actually you've missed the first 300 pages of context that are required to understand the boundaries of where you're living and how to determine the this and the that and what color was the diamond and how was it found and was it upside down when it was found and are you living in a Jewish land or not a Jewish... you can't get answers from the Talmud. And so instead what you have these handful of genuine geniuses who are able to absorb the entirety of the Talmud and come to legal rulings that use the Talmud like the Supreme Court uses the Constitution to determine case law within Jewish life. A lot of this happens because the Gaons are given political power as well as religious power in the new Islamic empire. And so these Gaons have real power to determine what Jewish living and Jewish law looks like. And so it is these genius heads of the academy that are doing that. And what this gives rise to is an entirely new genre of Jewish religious literature, which is known as the Sheila and the Tshuva, the question and the answer. These are also known as responsum, if you've heard that word instead of responsa or responsum. Same exact idea, whether you're dealing with the sort of Latin version or the Hebrew version here. And the basic idea is this. You have a question. Here's a famous one, for instance. I converted to Judaism. The prayer that we say when being called up to the Torah says, Asher bachar banu mikol hamim, that God chose us from amongst all of the peoples. Can someone who has converted to Judaism say that line, or should they say a different line because they chose Judaism rather than God having... That question, by the way, the answer is yes. You still say the line. That's the practical answer to this question. But that question is sent to the Gaonic academies, and the Gaon would answer that question and send it back. So we see that the Jews of Christian Europe, the Jews of the Ashkenaz, which just means France and Germany during this time period, the Jews of the Iberian Peninsula send their Shelas to the Gaons in Babylon. And by the time we get to the end of this period, by the time we get to the year 1000 or so, instead we see often that the letters are going in the opposite direction. All of a sudden, the letters are going to the Jews of the Iberian Peninsula and to the geniuses there. In fact, the example I gave about a convert saying that blessing famously is a Sheila that goes to Maimonides living in the Iberian Peninsula, not to a Gaon over in Babylon. So this is the religious background to what's happening, but we can also see the cultural and the political winds that are associated with this. And we can see the way that we are moving from the two civilizations of Babylon and Israel, or Babylon and Palestine, Roman Palestine, to the destruction, essentially, of Palestinian Jewish civilization, to the ascendancy of the Babylonian community, to the rise of the Iberian community, to these being the two poles, to the Iberian community being the center. You'll notice that the Ashkenazi community, the Jews of France, Germany, have not been mentioned here. And that's because the Jews of the Ashkenaz were seen as the uneducated hillbillies of the Jewish world. Part of this is not their fault. The oppression was so severe as a general rule within Christendom that it was really hard for Jewish civilization to thrive beyond just mere survival. But I'm getting the cart ahead of the horse here for a moment. But for instance, while Maimonides is living in the Iberian Peninsula studying Aristotle and talking about how God has no body and God is the word we have for the ultimate capital T truth of the universe that does not change, Rashi is living over in the Ashkenaz saying, oh, God just is like bigger and taller and stronger than us and walks along and has to pish and poop and God's like a person. But it's perfect person, right? Like there's a Mel Brooks line about God's perfect bowel movements, but go watch Mel Brooks if you'd like that. But regardless, I think we even see that there, right? Maimonides is dealing with cutting edge philosophy in Aristotle that is still relevant today, and Rashi is comparatively dealing with silliness. We're going to talk about Rashi. Don't worry, we're not going to.
Where did Rashi live?
Rashi lives in France. We're going to deal with Rashi next week. We're going to move to the Ashkenaz. But okay, Sarah.
Yeah, so my question is really simple. So what's going on in Baghdad and Syria, what we now call Syria and Iran, Iraq and Iran and Syria, that area, is that also, it's simultaneously pre-Muslim and Muslim during this period? Is that change happening during the same period, or is it has it already occurred?
So Islam arises as a. Were you here last week, Sarah?
I watched part of it.
Part of it,
but
okay.
not
Yeah,
everything got said because I had to watch it on YouTube.
No worries.
It doesn't record well.
So one of the frames I tried to give us last week was to understand the rise of what we think of as the Islamic Empire as actually the rise of the Arab Empire, that is a merged theocratic Arab empire. In that sense, not so different from the model that we see with the Neo-Persian Empire in its Zoroastrian theocratic empire, or the Byzantine Empire, or the earlier Persian empires that we saw that were right? Like it is that same kind of frame, and it's important to do that because it's easy to fall into Orientalist and Islamophobic tropes around it being different and something inherent about Islam. That's not what we're dealing with here. So what we see is that as the Arab Empire rises, it brings Islam as a cultural common denominator everywhere that it conquers and enforces. So we see that happen in Babylon.
Right.
And then we see the spread of this empire beyond that region in the 100 years or so after Muhammad. Right? Muhammad starts in the 620s or so. Within his lifetime, has conquered the entirety of the Arab Peninsula, and within 100 years of this, Islam is in Spain.
Yeah, I was just trying to partly figure this out because there's the whole Shia-Sunni split that causes a great deal of.
So that's the.
Stuff that gets that's part of the reason why I'm sure the Jews are going. Maybe we should just pack up and move.
I'm sure that's a part of it, but Jews, look, again, we treat Islam differently because of some really Orientalist Islamophobic reasons within ourselves that we don't even realize often. And if we just back away and treat this empire like the other empires, we can understand the Shia-Sunni split not as being fundamentally theological, but as being a political war between rival factions.
That's still what it is.
Sure. You can still understand it through that frame. Exactly. Okay, other questions? Nothing? Ask questions, because I think my next topic is too big to take on the rest of this class. I don't want to start us on either Maimonides or Rashi today. We can talk a little bit about philosophy,
I'm just trying to get the timing straight. So we enter the Iberian Peninsula around.
As early as 70 is where some scholars say. Certainly we know there are Jews there by the 3rd or 4th century, and we know that there are significant Jewish populations by the Visigoth era in the 5th, 6th, 7th centuries.
Okay. Because I'm just trying to get sort of the sort of rise, not only the scope of the political movements within the Muslim community and the spread of it, but also with it actually, so that it's like what's going on, because you're having the rise of Christendom and the fall of Rome, and I mean it's not Christendom, but the Roman Empire.
No, it is. I think you can understand the Byzantine Empire as Christendom, and you can certainly understand.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. This is all a part of that, and Jews are a part of this geopolitical framework, and that's why we talked about the Khazari Empire when we did, because just as we can look geographically and see that the Khazari Empire sits at the boundary between Islam and Christianity in the east, that same boundary in the west is the Iberian Peninsula. And Jews, once again, can sit in this uneasy positioning, particularly under Islam. Right?
So it's sort of the same scenario we saw when we were in quote unquote Palestine, Israel, in that area, and we were the buffer between the Greco-Roman Empire.
There you
and
go.
the
Yeah,
Persian
exactly.
Empire.
Great comparison. Yeah, exactly. Marilyn and then Larry.
I guess, are we applying a kind of 20th century or whatever concept of religion and faith groups or something of that nature? And what I'm hearing is empires, political entities. Is that what we're doing?
Yes, right. The notion of religion as we have it today is an 1800s model. It's a really new social construct that we have, 1700s, 1800s, and it is very different from what is happening at this time period. Religion, creed, is inseparable from political allegiance. You can't take those apart from each other. It is not the same thing as the way that Jewish identity is tribal, but it is similarly different from how contemporary religious identities work. Yeah, really important. Thank you, Marilyn.
In Christianity, they're killing each other over theological statements. You know, and so you're really bringing up the political piece of it. But,
So yes, they're doing that within Christianity at this time, but I actually would push back on that too and suggest that often they're killing each other because of political power dynamics, and the theological differences are actually pretty downstream of that. We choose our theologies to fit us rather than, yeah.
yeah, I mean, fully human, fully man, fully whatever, another, I mean, Aryan on the dock fighting, singing the songs.
Right. The bigger issue was, do you agree that my side is right and give allegiance to the correctness of my side, much more than whatever my particular opinion is. Yeah, exactly. Thanks, Marilyn. Larry.
So when you started talking about Visigoths, since everything I know about the Visigoths I learned in the 10th grade, I looked it up in Wikipedia, and according to Wikipedia, the Visigoths were already, when they occupied Spain, sort of Christian. They were Arians, Arian. That is, they didn't believe in the Trinity yet. And it seems from what Wikipedia is saying that some of this Inquisition-like activity may have started as part of the process of them becoming, and you mentioned the Nicene Creed, so as part of the process of them
Interesting.
adopting that form of Christianity and maybe proving, the old saying about no one is somebody who's a convert is always trying to prove that they're a true believer, so maybe it's part of trying to...
Interesting. I should spend more time reading Rabbi Wikipedia. I appreciate it.
Nicene Creed is 325.
Thanks, Marilyn. Okay, other questions, other thoughts here. Toby.
I'm struck again. The Guillaumes were given power and authority from the government. So this is another time when the shape of Judaism is it's shaped because of the powers that be. And the powers that be decide who within Judaism has the powers to make decisions for the religion.
Yep.
It's just I never even suspected this before.
Well, the religion
And now we have 3 or 4 examples of it.
It's endless. And I think I made this reference last week, but the place that so many who grew up in the Jewish community where our minds explode is when we begin to realize that Theodore Herzl and David Ben-Gurion are also examples of that.
Oh, with the British government?
Israel was not created by Jews, and it was not the
Right.
Zionists who made it. It was the European global powers who created Israel, and more than that, the Zionist movement, the early Zionist movement I'm talking about, didn't have power or support or legitimacy amongst the Jewish people. They just had it amongst European powers.
Well, in this country, Eisenhower formed a committee of Jewish leaders that he gave a lot
That
of
still
credit
exists
to.
today, right? President of the Council of Jewish Presidents of major organizations. Exactly. Exactly. It's always true, has always been true. And similarly, right, and this is the story of us writ large right here. We don't have the political power. We don't have the agency. What we do have is the ability to tell our own story in a way that makes it seem like we have political power and agency. Good.
And the other thing is, if you have a bunch of Jews, since we're relatively leaderless, because we're a highly decentralized religion, that where each sort of synagogue becomes its standalone unit, and we have loose associations with certain other branches and other synagogues. We don't have, I mean, the political power has to be given to us because we don't agree with it. You know, it's like, I don't think what you're saying is the right thing. That's how we operate. It's just the nature of being Jewish.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And right, like again, the key here is that we still have a very human desire to tell our story as if we have agency and power. You can go all the way back, look at not Jeremiah, what's the book that they say Jeremiah wrote that he didn't, about the destruction, why is my brain, the Chorban, Lamentations. Lamentations, yep, Eicha. Lamentations, which is gruesome literature written about the Babylonian invasion and genocide. Lamentations blames everyone but the Babylonians. In fact, Lamentations blames us. God is doing this because of the things we've done wrong or the whatever it is. And that is that exact same phenomenon. We don't have power, we don't have agency, and we have a very human need to tell our story in a way that makes it seem like we do and did. Toby.
But on the other hand, we could have a minion in the Senate. We could have a minion in the House, and I know in the White House and the cabinet, we have a different minion. So, when you look at the part of our problem is when you look at the percentage of Jews in the U.S. and you look at the number of Jews in very important positions in the press.
I know, it sounds like anti-Semitic conspiracies. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Well, that's partly because we have a whole thing about being able to read laws. I mean, that's what we do. That's why we're sitting here telling the story.
We certainly have sociology that led us to this point right now. But Toby, building off of what you were saying, I also think it's really important for us to understand that we are living in the moment that has the greatest amount of Jewish power in history. I mean, maybe we're 15 years off of the peak or something like that, but we are living in the peak of Jewish power at any point in global history, where whatever you think of the rise of anti-Semitism and so on and so forth in the United States, that right, you can have a minion in the Senate. Until somewhat recently, a third of the Supreme Court, right, if the Supreme Court hadn't been made illegitimate and undermined undemocratically, we would have 4 of 9 justices, right? Merrick Garland was supposed to be on the Supreme Court. We have real leadership in industry and Hollywood and the media, and that again, right? Like you sound like it's, yeah, we're overrepresented in these places, and it sounds pretty anti-Semitic. But that's real power. And say whatever you will about the ways that Israel has and has not wielded its power morally and immorally. There is a Jewish sovereign nation state with atomic weapons. Like, if you told our great-great-grandparents just that reality, they would tell us we were living in the Messianic era. And we miss that. We entirely miss that this is the greatest concentration of Jewish power in history.
Right, they were still not in power.
Military power, political power, soft power, social power, all of the ways that we
More than
mean
we
power.
ever had, but we're still, we're not a Jewish state. We don't control actions.
Of course. We're still not empire, but yes. Okay,
And
other...
that's also, we're here and in this powerful position because we're in a country that's hegemonic. We're in the
Yes.
American
Yes.
empire.
Okay, I want to open this up to other voices. Nancy.
But don't you think that our having finally achieved this is the result of having told the story?
Sure. You can't separate it out from
can't
how we tell the
separate it
story
from
and
that.
what we tell, and yeah,
Right.
exactly. Yep. John, I see you were unmuted. Is that on purpose?
It is on purpose. What you just stated about the power of Jewishness today in the world globally. Maybe there's a connection then because of if there is a rise in anti-Semitism going on right now. Maybe there's a connection there, a fear of a lot of people of the power that they see, and more power than of the power they see the Jews have now.
Sure.
For sure.
Sure. Right. And it feeds it. The existence of some Jewish power, as small as it is, feeds fears of Jewish power. Right. I mean, I kept saying it. You talk about Jews as leaders of banking and industry and politics and all the things we are in the United States. And if a non-Jew started saying that, not only would it feel anti-Semitic, it probably would be anti-Semitic. And it's wild to be able to square all of those circles together. Yep.
It's because we're still a minority, even though we hold all these positions of power, we would still be four, let's assume Merrick Garland were on there, we would still have been 4 of 5 on the Supreme Court, for example. And we still would not have had a Jewish head of this country.
Sure.
We would still not have had, be the majority in the Senate or the House. We would have had a minion, but that's really relative. I mean, it's powerful, but it's relatively small when you compare it to all the Christians, say, for example. We're still a minority, and maybe we're allowed in minority, but we're still a minority.
For sure. Okay, any other questions from anyone? Okay, I have referenced this in the past, and we'll reference it again, I'm sure. 2/3 of Spaniards in a study out in the early 2000s showed genetic ancestry to Jews. That is the scale of the forced conversion that happens in the Iberian Peninsula. Avi's saying Sicilians as well. That's interesting. So we are talking about an enormous Jewish civilization, a thriving Jewish civilization. Annette.
Would you say that again? I couldn't believe that.
2/3 of Spaniards, this is a study from 15, 20 years ago, have identifiable Jewish genetic ancestry. Right? That enormous. And again, right, like you only need one great-great-great-great-grandparent in order for these things to show up sometimes. But it's a huge scale that we're talking about of forced conversion. Okay. Until next week, everyone. Rashi next week.
Are you doing?
We're moving.
You're gonna
Why would I not do next week?
because of the bar mitzvah?
Oh, yeah, we're still doing next
Okay.
week. We're still doing next week. Yeah. Maybe we'll do just online next week, actually. Maybe we'll do that. Is that okay? Mm-hmm. Okay. Next week will just be online on Zoom, and we'll be back to normal the week after. And Gavi's bar mitzvahs a week from Saturday. So
And Mazel Tov.
come and join us.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thanks, everyone. Talk to you soon.